This is the teaching template that speaks to the issue of authority and jurisdiction in our society today. If you look behind me here, you see 4 different categories which represent 4 different governments or spheres of authority that exist in society today. And these are actually biblically defined as well in the Bible. If you wanted to look for these in the Bible, you would also find them also there as well to just demonstrate what I'm speaking about when I talk about spheres of authority and influence within those spheres. Now let's take a look at them individually. We have self-government, that's you. You have, again, there are 4 governments or 4 spheres of authority, but there's you with self-government. This is your sphere of authority. Your jurisdictional limit of authority is identified by the outside line here, but everywhere within your life, you have authority to operate. You have the right to make decisions about your own life. You can decide what time you get up in the morning and what time you go to bed at night. And all of these decisions that you can make about what you have for dinner, lunch, breakfast, whatever it is, how often you exercise, how you treat your kids, everything is actually decided within this sphere of authority. And you have that authority, again, up to a very, very well-defined and appropriate limit. We also have family government in our society, where groups of people get together and you have a mother and a father and their kids, and they, together as a family, the parents make decisions within that sphere of authority up to the jurisdictional limit of that authority as to what school the kids go to and whether they go to church on Sunday and how they spend their time, their free time, whether they're on Netflix or whether they're having devotions. All of this is decided within the family. You have church government, of course, as well, which many of you are familiar with, and of course, the all-important civil government. That is the other form of civil government. Now, this isn't the limit of all of the governments in society. We also have the government of the marketplace, which we'll be talking about again on a future national leadership briefing. But for now, we'll use these 4 as an illustration. Civil government, of all of the 4 different forms of government, we always like to point out that they are unique among all of the other forms of government, because this is the only government in our society that has unique powers. And those powers are, first, to legislate. We grant civil government the power to legislate for the good of all of society. They are able to make laws. We also give them the right and empower them to tax. So these special powers to legislate and to tax are unique to civil government, and they can be applied and have influence and impact on all the other forms of government. Now, where does civil government get its power? I mean, it just doesn't just come out of thin air. No, in fact, what happens is that individuals in society get together in tribes and they gather around their ideas and hoist individuals on their shoulders and say, go represent us in government. And they have elections and they gather people together. And then as they choose their people, during an electoral process, that's what this is. This is a conduit with which they transfer authority over to civil government so that civil government can act. Now, this transfer of authority is transferred in the form of what's called mandate. So we get together as citizens during an electoral process, and we gather our authority together as citizens, and we communicate or convey it to civil government so that they can execute a plan that we have approved of at election time. That is where civil government gets its authority. Now, in Canada, the sphere of authority and the jurisdictional limit of that authority is defined by documents like our Constitution. Our Constitution clearly lays out the provincial government's authority, the federal government's authority, and we can refer to those foundational documents in our society. We also have something called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which actually is intended to protect the citizen from civil government, and we can reference that document to make sure that we are having civil government operate within its appropriate sphere of influence. Now, the only time that anyone would ever cross over and beyond their jurisdictional limit of their authority is with something we call here at the National Leadership Briefing permissions. That is right, permissions. So for example, if a family as a form of government granted permission to the church to speak into or have authority within their family, then they would grant the church permission to actually operate outside of its jurisdictional limit of its authority and have influence in the family. As an individual, we actually give up some of our authority to participate as individuals within a family. And of course, with civil government, though, because we grant them special permissions, or special authority, pardon me, we don't grant them special permissions. Because we grant them special authority, we are in fact granting them permissions to operate outside of their jurisdictional limit of authority so that they can actually influence and impact our lives in a positive way. But what happens if, and this is the key question, is what happens if civil government reaches out beyond its jurisdictional limit of its authority and gets engaged in the church sphere, the family sphere, and sphere of the individual? What if they do that without permissions and without a mandate? So in other words, they're not given a mandate to act in this way. They're not granted special permissions to act in this way, yet they use the power, the special powers that we grant them through an election in the form of a mandate. They use that power in a corrupt way, and they impose their authority on the church, on families, and on the individuals. What is that called? Well, that is called tyranny. So if a civil government is operating outside of a jurisdictional limit of its authority, and it is imposing itself on other spheres of authority, like other governments in society, like these ones that are illustrated here, then they're acting in what we call a tyrannical way. And that is a government that needs to be restrained and pushed back to operating again within its jurisdictional limit of authority. Now, I told you before we started here, I said I was going to demonstrate to you the practical, real, obvious example of why the four pillars are so key and why the people that are in the faith communities of Canada that responded to those surveys were so wise when they identified them as the priorities. Well, here it is right here. Imagine that you have a civil government that has become corrupted and is now operating outside of the limit of its jurisdiction and imposing its authority on the authority of all of these different spheres of other governments in society. What if society on the whole, individuals, families, and churches, what if they all got together and they stood behind things like, let's use this as an example, we've seen this just recently in education, they stood behind a parent's right to raise their children the way they want. What if we all got together and used our combined influence as individual citizens and demanded that government operate within its own sphere of authority and put a pillar right there on the jurisdictional limit of civil government and said, that is the pillar to up and the point to up where you can operate as civil government. You can operate up to the point where you start imposing yourself and negatively impacting my ability to raise my children the way I want. That is now reinforcing the jurisdictional limit of civil government. What about the right of belief? What if the second pillar was placed right here between civil government and the individual, and everyone got together and said, you know what, civil government and civil government officials, I'm going to need you to respect and defend when necessary my right of belief and freedom of religion. That is something I'm going to need you to do. So I'm going to plant that pillar there, and me and all of my friends are going to use our combined influence to push you back and restrain you within that jurisdictional limit of your authority, the proper jurisdictional limit of your authority. Now, we could use an example in the church. Something that is very important to the church is how civil government and how society actually cares for the vulnerable among us. And we're called to care about the vulnerable. That's our responsibility. But sometimes civil government uses their legislative and taxation powers, and they actually can cause harm to people. Let's take a look at real life examples here. Euthanasia law that was just passed in Canada not long ago did not put in place adequate protections to protect vulnerable citizens that live among us in our communities. So people could actually be placed in harm's way by advancing euthanasia legally here in Canada, which has proven out to be the case as well. What about marijuana legislation that was brought forward not long ago, making edible marijuana products legal here in Canada? We're seeing more and more people present at emergency rooms here in Canada with overdose from cannabis. Cannabis overdoses at emergency rooms in both Alberta and Ontario, as an example, are 200% and 300% higher than they used to be before. So has civil government placed vulnerable people in harm's way by legislating things that are dangerous for them? Yes, in fact, they have. So we take the third pillar and we put it right there and say, you know what, we're going to require that every law and policy that you pass as civil government at the federal level is we're going to require that the first box you check is to make sure that you're providing for the safety and security of the citizens, with special attention being placed on protecting the vulnerable that live among us in our communities, like children who might have greater access to edible marijuana products, like perhaps you've got the drug addicted who are already having challenges. How are you going to protect them? What about people who choose to use THC products while they're driving? Do we have the proper law enforcement policy in place to protect citizens who might be in harm's way as a car goes down the highway being operated by somebody who's high on THC? So these are how you use the 4 pillars, is you place them on the limit, the jurisdictional limit of civil government, and you restrain them. Now, can an individual, one person, you or any one of these individuals here, can they alone restrain civil government? Well, the answer is obviously no. When you as a society get together and you transfer authority to civil government to act and to make decisions with regard to legislation and taxation, you're granting them a tremendous amount of power. And as a citizen, yes, it's true, we have incredibly in-depth authorities to act. And let me just give you a couple of examples here. As an individual, you have citizen authority, and we're going to teach you, if you're brand new, we're going to teach you how to use your citizen authority to act. This is authority every citizen has. You're going to be able to use that. You also have something called constituent authority. It is related to where you are living in Canada. You live within a very well-defined jurisdiction of Canada called an electoral district, and you have special authority as someone who lives in that district to speak to what happens in that district and to speak to your elected representative. That is a very specific authority, constituent authority it's called. You also have something called political party membership authority, which we have just recently used to help influence the outcome of a political process within a political party. And you also have, of course, kingdom authority, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to leave it to the pastors to talk about that. So as an individual citizen, you have a tremendous amount of authority to act, not only within your sphere of influence and authority, but you can actually influence other areas of society as well. But it is very small in comparison to the combined authority that we've transferred to civil government. So when they become corrupted in civil government, it takes a lot of us coming together, combining our influence to actually push them back. And as a tool in our hands, we have the 4 pillars. So again, I mentioned this during the 4-pillar story. If government goes to, as they're talking about right now, if they want to make a move that's going to expand eligibility of euthanasia to include children and the mentally ill, we're going to use the 3rd pillar and say, excuse me, but there's millions of citizens in Canada who believe that it is your priority to check that box to make sure that laws and policies are safe for people. And we consider the mentally ill and children to be vulnerable. So show us your plan for how you're going to protect vulnerable citizens from dying from a euthanasia death when they shouldn't. And so we're going to require that. We're going to actually mandate that of government. We're also going to use the 3rd pillar to say things like, for example, right now, the Liberal government, the federal Liberal government, has been toying with the idea of the full decriminalization of prostitution here in Canada. Well, if you're going to now take the purchasing of sex and make it legal again, because right now, to purchase sex in Canada, it is in fact illegal. If you're going to make it legal again, you're going to have to show us your plan as to how you plan to protect the young girls and women that are going to get trafficked into prostitution, because you are going to increase the demand for sex in Canada. There's obviously going to be a need for an increase in the supply. I'm going to need to see your plan. He's going to need to see your plan. She's going to need to see your plan. And together, we're going to stand behind the third pillar, and we're going to say, you can't pass legislation or enact policy without making sure that the vulnerable are protected. And young women and girls are being human trafficked all the time into prostitution, and that's just not acceptable. So this is how we combine our influence, stand behind the four pillars, and use them as a tool to restrain civil government as they wield the unusual and large power and authority of legislation and taxation in an inappropriate way. So that is how brilliant the church is. Again, bringing it right back to square one. I commend you all. Anybody who responded to that survey and spoke up and brought up these four things, they are absolutely ideal for restraining civil government. And I'm very excited to be someone who has the opportunity to advance these four pillars into society, culture, politics, and government, and share them with as many people as we can, so that we can always make sure civil government stays where they're supposed to stay. These are the things that we believe in. First, that parents have the right to raise their children the way they want. Second, that those we elect to serve us in civil government must respect and defend our right of belief and freedom of religion. Number three, that the laws and policies of civil government must provide for the safety and security of the citizens, especially the vulnerable among us. And number four, that it is inappropriate to heap debt upon the backs of our children and future generations. They came from you. They're your pillars. They're the things that you believe.